Okay, so today we are going to be discussing the constitutional basis of federalism. And you should have, in preparing for this talk, you should have reviewed your worksheet where you looked at Article 1, Section 8, which starts with Congress shall have power, and it lays out the enumerated powers, and also Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause. We'll get to that next lecture. You also should have looked at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10, which lists a number of powers which are denied or taken away from the states. Things like they cannot grant titles of nobility, they cannot tax imports, so they can't put taxes on goods coming in from other states. So that is what Article 1, Section 10 is, things that are denied to the states. And finally, Article 6, Section 2, which is the supremacy clause, which says three things are supreme to any state law: the Constitution, federal laws passed by Congress and signed by the President, or treaties. So those three things under the Supremacy Clause are supreme to state law. And I just wanted to start with the definition of federalism. I know this should be review. But as opposed to separation of powers, which is separating powers between branches of one level of government, so we have separation of powers at the federal level, the Supreme Court, or in the court system. Congress is the legislative branch and the executive. We have the same thing at the state level. Federalism, by contrast, is the split of power between two different levels of government. And of course, in the United States, that's the federal government and the states. So we're going to look at the constitutional roots of how power is split in the United States. All right, the constitutional source of federalism is the 10th Amendment. So we're going to take a look at the language. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So let's take a look at what that means. The powers not delegated. When we look at that word, you should think of a synonym for this as given. So the powers not given to the United States. Well, in the context of our federal system, when we're talking about the United States, we're talking about the federal government. So the powers not given to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it, the it here is the Constitution. So when you're looking for powers that are prohibited by the Constitution to the states, where would you look to see that? Hopefully, based on your work leading up to this, you remember that would be Article 1, Section 10 that denies the states the powers to tax imports and some other things as well. All right, so the powers not given to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the Constitution to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. When you get to this word, I want you to think of this as the term individually. The states individually, as opposed to the states collectively, which is the United States, the federal government, are reserved to the states individually or to the people. Okay, let's take a look at that. So essentially, what you have is that it says there are some powers which are delegated to the federal government. We call these the enumerated powers. And of course, we talked all about those in the separation of powers unit. All right, so those are the enumerated powers. Those are the powers that are expressly given to the Congress. Outside, we're going to have on our diagram the powers that, all powers that can be exercised by governments. Okay, so in our system, some of the enumerated powers, we talked about these in our separation of powers of units, are, for example, the power to tax, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. The power to borrow money on the credit of the United States, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 is the Commerce Clause, the power to create a navy, the power to create an immigration policy, the power to declare war, etc. You can look in Article 1, Section 8 for Clauses 1 through 17 for a listing of the specific enumerated powers. Okay. Now, in our system, powers that are not delegated to the federal government belong to the states. And that's exactly what the 10th Amendment is telling you. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by the Constitution to the states are reserved to the states or to who? The states or the people. So on our diagram, we're going to have the people be represented by outside of the circle. So let's explore how this works. What are some things that you know, just as from being an American, that are rights that belong to the people? Hopefully, a number of things will come to mind. So I'll just give some silly ones to start out with. Basically, what you wear, so clothes. What you eat for breakfast, who you hang out with, food, friends, are some simple things that we know belong within the choice of the individual. How about other things? What about speech? Well, we know that speech does belong. We have freedom of speech in this country, but are there any limits to that? And most likely you know that the answer is certainly there are limits. So for example, we're going to get to this in the Bill of Rights unit, you know that in school, your right to free speech absolutely can be infringed upon. So for example, through dress code, you can be sent home for wearing a t-shirt that has certain things written on it, for using certain language in school, etc. So speech, I'm going to put, it's mostly resides within the power of the individual, but the states can and do regulate it. What about something like abortion? Abortion is the same idea in that, according to Roe v. Wade, which we'll study again next unit in the Bill of Rights unit, Roe v. Wade said that the right to have access to abortion services belongs within the rights of the woman up until viability, which is roughly about the end of the second trimester. At that point, the state may regulate a woman's access to abortion services. What about marriage? Marriage is another one. We know that, of course, nobody could tell anybody who to marry, but the states define many of the things relating to marriage, for example, the age at which you can get married. And we all know that over last summer there was the gay marriage Supreme Court case, which we will also be studying in the Bill of Rights unit. So marriage is another thing which lies largely outside the circle, but states can regulate it. All right, this diagram is very important. Here's why. It lays out the concept that in our system, the federal government is a government of limited power. It only has the powers that are given to it by the Constitution. Now, when you think of the history of the Constitution, that makes perfect sense. Who created whom? Which level of government created which level of government? Hopefully from the foundation units, you know very clearly that on the moment that independence was declared, there were governments in America. And those were, initially they had been colonial governments, now they were the state governments. But the moment independence was declared, those state governments already existed. Those state governments came together, and in the Constitutional Convention, they created the federal government. And once the Constitution was ratified by who? Of course, by the state governments. Those are the ones who created that entity that we call the federal government. That federal government only had the powers given to it by the Constitution. Now, did the states have the intention of saying, hey, federal government, you take all the power. We don't want any power anymore. You take over. Of course not. The states wanted to retain their power. So they only gave the federal government certain limited powers. Those are the enumerated powers. Everything else belongs either to the states. We know that. States regulate truancy laws, speed limits, drug laws, criminal laws, those types of things. Or to the people, and we talked about some things like that. Now, in the next talk, we're going to be talking about the way in which those enumerated powers are expanded a little bit by what's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and we'll be talking about that in the next lecture.